So what is a radio producer and what do I do? And again, this really varies depending on the show, because obviously what a producer does, if you're working on like a narrative documentary podcast to what you're doing working on a music radio show, are like very different. But the general things are, you would come up with ideas and pitching for any kind of show. You would be pitching content ideas. You would be doing any research that needs to be done, either to assist the presenter or, as background, to producing research packs, etc., etc. Scripting and briefing the presenter, so it's a big one. Often when you hear presenters, they are actually reading from scripts. Like, that's it. A lot of people don't realise that a lot of presenters are heavily briefed. All the research is done by a producer, and they have been given, all that information. That can be a script that's either like word for word, or more often it would be like bullet points, just so the producer kind of has a view of the overarching where the show is going to go, what's going to be in it. If you're working on a music radio show, you would have like a running order. We have particular programs that would do a running order. So you'd have like, we're going to have like an ident or a jingle here. We're going to play these 3 tracks. Then we're going to do a link about this. Then we're going to, you'd plot it all out so that you know where it's going, and you can kind of communicate that easily with your presenter. So yeah, curation, having an eye on the bigger picture, booking and briefing guests. So that's often quite a big one, finding people to come on and talk about interesting things, making sure they're available. Often if you hear like Giles Peterson, if you listen to the Giles Peterson radio show, he'll always have like different guests on, and quite often those interviews have been recorded at another time and then they're edited by the producer and they're played out in the show. So yeah, I think on like Giles Peterson's quite a good example. So he has a lot of input into that show, and he does choose his guests. I think you can kind of hear, but it would be a conversation between him and his producer, and his producer might suggest things to him. And that does lead on to the producer-presenter relationship. So if you're working with a new presenter, it might be your job to kind of get the best performance out of them, to make sure that they're kind of, that they're confident, that they're relaxed, that they're like giving you the best kind of performance they can. Directing them, if they've like fluffed up a line, you might have to re-record it. So you'd have an eye, particularly in podcasting or pre-records, you'd be listening through for any like mistakes or where they've kind of made something needs to be clarified or anything like that. And then you'd be asking them to re-record certain bits and slotting it all in. And the radio producer also often does recording, studio operations. So yeah, you're running the studio as well. And then with anything pre-recorded, you'd be editing that show, building that show. And yeah, usually you're kind of in charge of the social content as well, making clips, having an overview of the marketing and how you're promoting that show. Although I said in the previous slide about all the different roles that there are potentially in radio, and what generally the teams are quite small. It's often just a producer, sometimes a producer / producer who is also presenting, and sometimes it's just a producer and a presenter, and your exec is probably quite kind of removed. So it's really, certainly on the residency, it was just me and, the DJs I was working with. And I had an assistant producer who'd just do the like music logging, music reporting. They'd make clips and social content. And that was it really. But yeah, on the podcast I'm working on now, which is for the World Service, it's much more involved, it's much more journalistic, it's much more detail oriented. I'm working with 2 execs and a whole commissioning team. So yeah, it really, really varies, like depending on the type of show you're working on.